First, I want to thank those of you who put obstacles in my way. You're not all in this room. There are a lot of you, though. Because you made me be smarter and stronger than I thought I could be. I want to thank everyone who discouraged me, because you made me be self-motivating. And I want to thank everyone who has loved and supported me, because it is for you that I do everything. And with that, Scribblers. Lilith Abernathy. Lilith. That's a really pretty name, but I just can't put a face to it. She's about this high, Mrs. Abernathy said, holding out her hand flat at eye level. She's got sort of brown hair and brown eyes, light skin. She sighed. She probably sat at the back. Oh, Jung's friend. Jung? I don't know that name. Mr. Bizzotti stroked his goatee for a moment. Come to think of it, I haven't seen either of them for a few days. I didn't think anything of it because the weather is getting nice. I've got a lot of absences. She went home thinking it had all been a mistake. Lilith would be home when she got there. As she stood at the bus stop, she turned to look in the window of the appliance store in the corner. A dozen televisions showed the traffic on the street, captured by a camcorder at the top of the window. Mrs. Abernathy did what she always did at this bus stop, sizing herself up in her wool coat and knitted cap, then scanning the street behind her. Cars passed, business people talking on cell phones, but her eye went to a couple walking down the opposite side of the street. She knew that hair, that mousy, lank hair. She knew that tattered pink backpack. She knew that slumped, defeated walk. And when the woman turned and looked at the camera, Mrs. Abernathy saw Lilith's face and whirled around. "Lilith!" she shouted. And although everyone in the street turned to look, there was no couple across the street. Blushing, Mrs. Abernathy turned back round to the television, but the couple was gone there too. She thought briefly about running down the only street they might have turned on, but before she could make up her mind, the bus came. With a sigh, she climbed aboard, thinking, she looked fine, she'll be home soon. And she was. With no fanfare and no excuses, Mrs. Abernathy came out of the bathroom the following afternoon and found Lilith sitting at the kitchen table, her homework spread out in front of her. "How long have you been sitting there?" "Since lunchtime," Lilith said, not looking up from her books. "Where you been, kiddo? I was so worried." "I was with friends. Well, a friend. I was fine." "Kid, you've been gone for days. I panicked. I went to your school and asked your professors. Is he a boyfriend?" Lilith looked up at her mother in disgust. "No, he's not my boyfriend." "Well, is he your friend?" "Yeah, Mom. Yeah." She turned to look back at her books and ignored any more of Mrs. Abernathy's attempts at conversation. Mrs. Abernathy had all but forgotten it just a few days later when she found the first drawing. She'd gone into Lilith Stark's spare bedroom and saw something pinned above the night table. It was a letter-sized piece of paper, torn at one corner, covered in scribbled lines like a crazy spider web. She put her face close to it, but couldn't make any sense out of the mosaic of tiny shapes, each line bordered by a tiny mathematical equation, none of which made any sense to her. Tiny numbers or letters shaded many of the angles. She knew that it was nothing like anything Lilith had ever done, and assumed it must have been her friend Jung. As she walked to the door, looking over her shoulder at the piece of paper, the image resolved itself into a picture of a figure standing at a bus shelter in front of a shop window full of televisions. "What are you doing in here?" Lilith said, and although she sounded alarmed, Mrs. Abernathy could still hardly hear her voice. "I'm sorry, kiddo, I was just putting your clean laundry on your bed." "Well, you're done. Can you get out now?" Lilith crossed the room, pulled the picture from the wall, and turned it upside down on the drawing table. "It's really good, sweetie. Did you do it?" "Get out." Mrs. Abernathy sighed and closed the door on her way out. "Mom?" Lilith's call was barely audible through her door. "Yeah, kiddo?" "I'm sorry." The door opened a crack. "It's his. Jung's. He drew it when we saw you at the bus stop." "You were there?" "Well, sort of. I mean, we both saw you there when Jung started drawing. He told me that if he has the right formula that describes a person, he can make calculations that show where they are, and he just needs to do the math to see whatever he wants." "Huh," Mrs. Abernathy said. "That's really something." Lilith's face fell and the door started to close. "No, really, that's fascinating, kiddo," Mrs. Abernathy said, hoping the note of panic wasn't audible to Lilith. "Could I see something of yours? You never show me your drawings no more." "I know," Lilith said, even more softly than usual. She pulled a pad from under her drawing table, chose a pen from the box, and began drawing. The pen was dark purpley blue, and she drew a series of concentric circles interrupted by jagged lightning bolts. "This is what's going on in your mind right now." Lilith said. You're confused and you're trying to hide it. You're suspicious and you're desperate. For a brief second, Mrs. Abernathy felt as though she'd had the wind knocked out of her, but she continued to look at the picture. It was true. She could see how it showed her mind turning in on itself with questions and doubts. She followed each jagged line that grasped at Lilith's affections, which seemed to constantly slip through her fingers. How do you do that? You do. I just hold the pen. You make it move, Lilith said, capping the pen and putting it back in the box. At her book club meeting the next Thursday, Mrs. Abernathy waited for the better part of 45 minutes for some opportunity to slip Lilith and Hugh's drawings into the conversation, but the latest Margaret Atwood novel didn't leave her any. It wasn't until Amelia served tea that she had the courage to bring it up. I was at the museum the other day and I saw the most interesting thing, she said, taking a cookie. There was an installation of art by two artists. One used math in his drawings. The write-up said he could draw people using a mathematical formula. And the other one claimed that she just held a pen and other people's feelings through the pictures. Have you ever heard of such a thing? The other ladies looked at her. No, I haven't, Amelia said. And I didn't see that when I was at the museum just yesterday. That installation must have moved on, Mrs. Abernathy said quickly. Wait, how can you draw someone with a mathematical formula? Phoebe asked. Isn't that how they draw buildings? It's like drafting, isn't it? Karen said, taking her third cookie and topping it off with half a can of Diet Coke. But a human being ain't a building, Mrs. Abernathy said. So one of them does drafting of human beings and the other one does some kind of Ouija board thing, Amelia asked. Mrs. Abernathy tried to recall precisely what the drawings looked like, but the more she thought about it, the more she forced herself to remember them as just that, drafting and Ouija boards. When she got home that evening, she heard a murmuring coming from Lilith's room. When she knocked on the door, the murmur went suddenly silent. The door opened a crack and a single eye peeked out. What? You got company, kiddo? Sort of. Can I get you anything? Sure. Can we have chips and sour cream? Mrs. Abernathy left and came back with the requested snacks on a tray, along with a couple of sodas. When she tapped on the door with her foot, it opened into darkness. Mom, this is Young, Lilith said, staring at the floor. A pale, slightly doughy boy with wiry black hair sat hunched over the drawing table. He raised a hand in greeting, but not his head. Can I see what you're working on? Mrs. Abernathy asked, but Lilith stepped between her and the table, reaching for the tray. Mom, can we just work, please? We're doing homework. Of course, kiddo, Mrs. Abernathy said, and allowed herself to be ushered out of the room. When school let out for summer, the constant soft hum of their conversation turned into the backdrop of Mrs. Abernathy's daily life. Around the 4th of July, the buzz stopped. Mrs. Abernathy came home from the market expecting to hear the mouse-warren sounds of the two artists at work, but could tell from the utter stillness in the house that she was alone. She knocked on Lilith's door, and when no one answered, she calmed the lurch in her stomach by telling herself they were probably just kissing. She breathed hard for a few seconds, trying to seem cool and blasé before bursting into her daughter's room, where she fully expected to see the girl entwined with a pale college freshman on the bed. She opened the door to an empty room. She stood, staring at the bed, trying to will it to contain her daughter in whatever company, but nothing appeared. She stood, breathing so loudly that she could hear nothing else. She looked at the neatly made bed, its plain blue blanket even all around, only now there were drawings pinned up on the walls around the bed, his mathematical mosaics entwined with her emotional swirls, now on the same piece of paper, now on different ones. She turned on the light and looked at them all, moving backward and forward, squinting and tilting her head, trying to see the picture hidden in each of them. She saw some pictures easily enough. Herself sitting on the couch and watching television, her image distorted by the image on the screen. Outside the frame, tiny clouds punctuated faint wavy lines, boredom with occasional thoughts. Another one, her with one hand reaching up, out. She looked down, her other hand somewhere out of view. Mrs. Abernathy leaned over, trying to emulate the picture, one hand up, the other down. It took nearly 5 minutes of stiff pantomime to realize this was the crouch she employed at the ATM. Long lines and boxes surrounded her tiny mosaic face. She could make no sense of the rest. Perhaps they were things that hadn't happened yet, or things that were happening to other people in other places. One looked like a faraway view of a group of children playing, but it could as easily have been a pack of dogs or cars in a parking lot. The next morning, she came out of the kitchen with a cup of coffee to find Lilith sitting at the dining room table eating cereal. You went into my room again, Lilith said, and Mrs. Abernathy couldn't tell whether or not she was angry. I was just looking for you. I see you made a lot more drawings. Did you see the one of you at the ATM? Hyung did that one by himself. Money doesn't have any feelings. What were the lines around the picture? That showed where all the bills you took out had been before and where they'd go next. Hyung says that money is even easier than people because the basic formula is always the same, although really old money, like that was minted a long time ago, is harder because it's been in more places. Mrs. Abernathy sipped her coffee to cover the fact that she had no idea what to say. When she tried to explain it to her new therapist, she hadn't been able to make herself understood how the children made the drawings, why they were so disquieting. Her therapist had asked her to bring one of the drawings in, and when she pulled one out of her purse that showed her from above, sitting at the laundromat and reading a book, lines of boredom and weariness coming from the machines and going into her like industrial fumes, Dr. Frankel's face went carefully blank. These don't look like children's drawings, Dr. Frankel said in his always neutral doctor voice. This one isn't Lilith's, Mrs. Abernathy said. This one is Hyung's. How old is Hyung? I don't know, 19, maybe 20. Isn't that a bit old to be spending time with your daughter? Mrs. Abernathy looked at the doctor in confusion. But she's 20 years old. Dr. Frankel seemed to lose his composure just for a second, long enough for Mrs. Abernathy to see the shock below the surface. Mrs. Abernathy, I thought she was 5 or 6. I think this by itself shows that we have a lot of work ahead of us. The next time she spotted them, Mrs. Abernathy was riding the bus. This time, the images of their faces, created by the pattern of type on a newspaper, stared up at her from the sidewalk. Mrs. Abernathy twisted around in her seat, looking until they were out of sight. From then on, instead of reading a book or watching the televisions in public spaces, she looked for Lilith and Hyung. And once she began looking, she started seeing them everywhere. In the burn pattern on her toast at the corner diner, walking next to her on store surveillance camera footage, but most often in the static patterns of any video monitor not picking up a signal. She laid armloads of coats over the couch to let the smell of mothballs air out of them. She turned on the TV out of habit and realized that the cable was out again, the screen a tiny snowstorm. As she spread the sleeves out over the couch, she looked up to see Lilith watching her. In the flickering gray of static, the pale, lank-haired image raised a tentative hand and waved. Hey, kiddo, Mrs. Abernathy said, and then wondered whether she should feel self-conscious for talking to the television. The ghostly image smiled. I washed your sheets and now I'm airing the winter coats, she told the television. It's not going to snow for a few weeks yet, but there's a nip in the air. The flickering image smiled but shook his head. Well, it's here when you want it anyway. From then on, she spoke to all the images, wherever she saw them. She clipped every magazine image, collected every wallpaper sample, took pictures of every water stain that could possibly be either Lilith or Hyung. She studied the images, looking at every digit, character, pixel, analyzing its meaning. Are you still seeing her? Dr. Frankel asked. Mrs. Abernathy looked a little ashamed. She pulled out a new series of drawings of herself at a lunch counter, herself at a baseball game, herself crossing the street, each a mosaic of lines and formulas and waves and colors. Have you tried just turning the set off? I can't, Mrs. Abernathy said. I'd miss her. Mrs. Abernathy looked at the drawings arrayed on the coffee table. She reached out and touched each one of them. They make me feel closer to her. But they're all drawings of you, Dr. Frankel said in the exasperated tone of a man who's been trying to make the same point for a long time. But they're hers. She's not there. She hasn't been there for months. Mrs. Abernathy looked at Dr. Frankel with something akin to pity and sighed. You know, she finally said, gathering up the drawings, I don't think there's any more that you and I are going to solve together. When she got home, she carefully pinned the pictures back onto the walls of Lilith's room. Lilith's smell, faint as it had always been, was gone now. The room smelled damp and unlived in. Mrs. Abernathy sat on the bed and looked at the furniture and the walls now covered in tiny drawings. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, but no amount of desire could conjure up Lilith's smell. When she opened them, she turned her head from side to side, taking in the hundreds of drawings without focusing on any of them. She turned her head faster and faster, the lines blurring as she stared, her eyes going glassy. As she continued to move, rather than becoming more blurry, the scenes began to resolve themselves. The drawings she hadn't been able to make out before were clear. Here, Lilith lying in a bed, waves of contentment and tendrils of dreams drifting from her inert body. There, Hyung sitting in a park with a sketch pad in his lap, lines in the background showing everywhere he'd been earlier. Lilith and Hyung having a meal together, Lilith smiling a big, confident smile that Mrs. Abernathy had never seen before. Her head started to hurt, and she slumped over and rested it in her hands. Her eyes felt hot and swollen, and she thought she was going to cry, but the tears didn't come. After shaking and heaving for a few more minutes, she got up from the bed. She smoothed back the perfectly smooth covers and left, closing the door behind her. Thank you.